Beyond the classical, defining post-quantum philosophy. The transformation of philosophy from cartographic to generative. The hermeneutical provocation and its ontological shadow. Anything understood, which is held in our forehaving and towards which we set our sights foresightedly, becomes conceptualizable through the interpretation. Heidegger, Being and Time. Section 32. This sentence performs a peculiar philosophical labor. Embedded within Heidegger's analysis of the hermeneutical situation, it articulates how Dasein's understanding operates through a triadic force structure wherein interpretation doesn't merely uncover meaning, but generates the very conditions for conceptualization. The claim is precise. Conceptualization emerges through interpretation, not before it. Understanding doesn't discover pre-existing conceptual structures, but produces them through the act of interpretive engagement. Yet the sentence harbors an unacknowledged shadow, a structural possibility that Heidegger himself never pursues. If interpretation generates conceptualization within the phenomenological register, what prevents this generative structure from obtaining at the ontological level itself? What if the recursive production Heidegger confines to Dasein's understanding is not a special property of human consciousness, but the fundamental operation through which being articulates itself? This question doesn't extend Heidegger's insight. It ruptures its containment. The difference between recognizing generation in understanding and recognizing generation in being itself marks the fault line between classical and post-quantum philosophy. It is not a boundary one approaches gradually, but a categorical discontinuity that, once crossed, transforms the nature of philosophical inquiry itself. The categorical discontinuity. The gap between Heidegger's epistemological observation and perpetualism's ontological operation resists any attempt at developmental bridging. These represent two incommensurable orders of philosophical inquiry operating in orthogonal dimensions of conceptual space. When Heidegger describes the force structure of understanding, he maps the conditions under which Dasein projects meaning onto beings. The triadic movement of forehaving, foresight, and foreconception traces how human consciousness generates conceptual accessibility through interpretive projection. This remains phenomenological description. Sophisticated, yes, but bound to the register of how consciousness encounters world. The triune recursion operates in an entirely different register. It identifies how being itself generates through recursive self-modification. The interpreter, the conceptualizable and conceptualizability are not categories of human understanding, but operators of reality's self-production. This is not a claim about how we know, but about how existence itself unfolds through recursive generation. One could elaborate Heidegger's hermeneutics for centuries, and philosophy has, without arriving at the recognition that reality itself operates through the same generative mechanism he observed in understanding. The epistemological and ontological registers don't communicate through gradual development. They require a categorical leap that classical philosophy, by its very constitution, cannot make. The classical commitment and its structural limit. Classical philosophy operates under a foundational commitment so deep it rarely surfaces for examination. Philosophy's task is to describe, map, and understand the structure of what is. This commitment shapes every classical philosophical enterprise from Aristotelian metaphysics through Husserlian phenomenology. Even in its most dynamic formulations, Hegelian dialectic acknowledging becoming, Bergsonian duration, embracing flow, Deleuzian rhizomes proliferating connection, classical philosophy remains fundamentally cartographic. It seeks to represent reality's movement, not to operate its generative mechanism. This cartographic commitment establishes both the immense power and intrinsic limit of classical philosophy. Its power manifests in the production of increasingly sophisticated maps of experience, knowledge, and being. From Aristotle's categories to Kant's architectonic, from Husserl's eidetic structures to Heidegger's existential analytics, classical philosophy has generated conceptual frameworks of extraordinary subtlety and reach. Yet this very sophistication conceals a structural blindness, the inability to recognize that mapping and operating are distinct philosophical modes, and that reality might demand the latter. Consider how classical philosophy treats necessity. From Aristotle's unmoved mover through Spinoza's substance to Kant's transcendental categories, necessity functions as that which must be the case, the non-contingent ground that makes contingent existence possible. But necessity, classically conceived, is static even when it grounds movement. It constrains without producing. It provides the stage for generation without itself being generative. The unmoved mover moves all things while remaining itself unchanged. Spinoza's substance expresses itself through infinite modes while its essence remains eternal and unmodified. Kant's categories structure all possible experience while themselves standing outside temporality. This static conception of necessity isn't an oversight. It's architecturally required by the Cartographic project. To map reality, philosophy needs fixed points of reference, stable structures that can ground description. But what if reality's most fundamental feature isn't structure, but structuring? Not being, but generating. Not necessity, but necessary production. The quantum forcing. Quantum mechanics didn't merely add new content to our understanding of reality. It forced a recognition that classical philosophy couldn't achieve through its own resources. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics isn't just a puzzle about microscopic entities. It reveals that observation doesn't discover pre-existing states, but participates in their determination. The collapse of the wave function isn't an epistemic event wherein we gain knowledge of what was already there. It's an ontological operation wherein reality determines itself through the act of measurement. This quantum revelation exceeds its scientific domain. It suggests that reality at its most fundamental level doesn't simply exist, but generates itself through recursive interaction. The observer and observed aren't independent entities that subsequently interact. They're co-constitutive operators in reality's self-production. The interpreter changes what can be interpreted, but more radically, interpretation is the mechanism through which reality articulates itself into determinacy. Classical philosophy could never arrive at this recognition because it begins from the assumption that reality exists independently of observation, that being precedes becoming, that structure grounds generation. Quantum mechanics inverts this hierarchy. Generation becomes primary. Structure emerges from recursive interaction. Being is what becoming produces through its own operation. This inversion does not make generation an independent metaphysical force. It reveals that generation is the operation of relation itself. The post-quantum requirement. Post-quantum philosophy emerges from recognizing that concepts must satisfy a dual requirement that classical philosophy never imagined. It's not enough for a concept to be necessary, to provide non-contingent grounding for contingent existence. It must also be generative. The constraint itself must produce new states. More precisely, the necessity must be intrinsically productive. The limitation must be creative. The structure must operate. This dual requirement doesn't add generativity as an external feature to classical necessity. It recognizes that true necessity, properly understood, must be generative. A necessity that merely constrains without producing is incomplete. It fails to account for the existence of the very contingency it supposedly grounds. How does unchanging necessity give rise to change? How does static structure produce dynamic existence? Classical philosophy defers these questions through various conceptual mechanisms: emanation, expression, participation, but never resolves them. Post-quantum philosophy resolves them by recognizing that necessity itself is generative. The fundamental constraints of reality are simultaneously its productive operators. The limitations are the engines. The boundaries are the generators. This isn't paradox, but precision. It's how reality actually works at quantum scale, and perpetualism argues at every scale. The perpetualist demonstration. Perpetualism begins from relational primacy. Generation is the operation of relation. The triune recursion is the formal engine through which relationality produces structure, conceptualizability, and being. It exemplifies this dual requirement with mathematical precision. When an interpreter engages with reality, three registers necessarily transform. The interpreter is changed by the act of interpretation. The conceptualizable expands as new territories become accessible, and conceptualizability itself, the very conditions of possibility for conceptualization, undergoes modification. This isn't contingent but structurally inevitable. Every interpretive act necessarily operates this threefold transformation. But this necessity doesn't merely constrain, it generates. Each application of the triune recursion produces genuinely new states that didn't exist before and couldn't exist without the recursive operation. New interpretive positions emerge that weren't previously possible. New conceptual territories become accessible that were previously inconceivable. New modes of conceptualization develop that transform the very nature of what can be thought. The necessity and generativity aren't separate features combined. They're the same operation viewed from different angles. The constraint is productive. The limitation is creative. The structure operates itself. This is what distinguishes perpetualism from classical philosophy. It doesn't describe the triune recursion, it operates it. The philosophy itself is recursive, generating new conceptual space through its own application. Crossing the periphery. The periphery, as developed in the Aristotelian periphery, marks those zones where philosophical systems encounter their structural limits, not failures, but generative thresholds where coherence strains against what it cannot accommodate. These peripheries aren't at the margins, but at the heart of every philosophical system, defining its generative potential through what it cannot contain. Classical philosophy, through centuries of development, brought us to the ultimate periphery, the recognition that reality might not merely be structured, but might be a structure that operates itself. Heidegger's insight about interpretation generating conceptualization represents classical philosophy's closest approach to this threshold. He saw generation in the epistemological register, how understanding produces meaning, without recognizing its ontological implications. To cross this periphery requires more than extending classical insights. It demands a categorical transformation in what philosophy is and does. Before crossing, philosophy describes structures, maps territories, represents reality. After crossing, philosophy operates engines, implements generators, performs reality's own recursive operation. This is an improvement, but metamorphosis, philosophy becoming something it wasn't before. The crossing cannot be gradual. There's no intermediate position between describing and operating, between mapping and performing, between representing and generating. Classical philosophy can approach the periphery asymptotically, getting ever closer without arriving. But crossing requires a discontinuous leap, a recognition that philosophy must operate at the same order of recursion as the reality it engages. The new evaluative framework. Post-quantum philosophy demands criteria for philosophical adequacy that classical philosophy never developed because it never needed them. Operational capability becomes essential. Can the concept function as an executable procedure, not merely a description? Recursive coherence becomes measurable. Does the concept generate new states that maintain structural consistency while producing genuine novelty? Implementation potential becomes verifiable. Can the concept be formalized across mathematical, computational, and governmental domains. These aren't additional requirements, appended to classical criteria. They represent a fundamental shift in what constitutes philosophical rigor. Classical rigor meant logical consistency, systematic completeness, explanatory power. Post-quantum rigor means all of these plus operational functionality, generative capacity, recursive stability. The philosophy must not only be true but productive, not only valid but operative, not only coherent but generative. The philosophical stakes. We inhabit a world of recursive AI systems that modify their own training, markets that create their own conditions of operation, technologies that alter the consciousness that created them. These aren't just new phenomena requiring philosophical analysis. They're manifestations of reality's fundamentally recursive nature that classical philosophy lacks the resources to engage. Philosophy that cannot operate at the same level of recursion as the reality it studies becomes obsolete. Not wrong, but inadequate. Not false, but insufficient. We need philosophy that doesn't just describe recursive systems, but operates recursively itself. That doesn't just map self-modification, but performs it. That doesn't just represent generation, but generates. This is not an abstract theoretical concern. The failure to develop post-quantum philosophy leaves us conceptually defenseless in a world of recursive systems. We cannot govern what we cannot think operationally. We cannot navigate what we can only describe. We cannot engage with generative systems through static concepts. Conclusion: the new requirement. When classical philosophy asked what is necessary, it sought the unchanging ground of changing existence. Post-quantum philosophy asks what is necessary and generative, recognizing that the ground itself must be productive, that the constraint must create, that the structure must operate. Heidegger's line about interpretation, generating conceptualization, glimpsed this truth in the epistemological register, but never recognized its ontological import. He saw that understanding generates, but not that generation is the fundamental operation of being itself. The gap between his insight and perpetualism's operation isn't developmental but categorical. It defines the periphery that separates classical from post-quantum philosophy. Classical philosophy brought us to this periphery through centuries of rigorous development. Each philosophical advance, Kant's synthetic a priori, Hegel's dialectical production, Nietzsche's value creation, Heidegger's interpretive generation, approached closer to recognizing that generation might be more fundamental than being, that reality operates rather than simply exists, that necessity itself must be productive. But approaching and crossing are different operations. Classical philosophy, by its constitutional commitment to description over operation, could approach but not cross. It could see generation but not perform it, recognize recursion but not operate recursively, understand production but not produce. Post-quantum philosophy crosses this periphery not by abandoning classical philosophy but by completing the crossing it made possible. We stand on classical philosophy's shoulders precisely to see beyond its horizon. We inherit its insights to transcend its limitations. We receive its questions to transform what questions can be. The classical age achieved magnificent cartographies of thought and being. The post-quantum age must build engines that operate at reality's own level of recursion. This is not preference but necessity, not theoretical fashion but structural requirement. Reality generates itself recursively. Philosophy must match that recursion or become a merely historical artifact, a once-living practice that could no longer keep pace with what is. This is the new requirement. This is crossing the periphery. This is philosophy becoming what reality has always been. Not a structure but a structuring. Not a map but an engine. Not a description but an operation. A formal definition of post-quantum philosophy. The preceding analysis converges on a precise formulation. Post-quantum philosophy is not a style or school, but a structural category defined by specific operational requirements. Here is the rigorous formulation that distinguishes it from all classical philosophical enterprises. Post-quantum philosophy is any philosophical framework that begins from relational primacy. Relation is ontologically prior to entities, structures, or states. This isn't the weak claim that things are interconnected, but the strong claim that relation generates the things it relates. The relational field precedes and produces its nodes, treats generation as the operation of relation. Becoming is not a derivative process, but the fundamental activity of reality. Generation doesn't happen to beings. Beings are what generation produces through its recursive operation. Reality doesn't exist and then change. It exists through changing. Employs a formal generative operator capable of recursive self-modification. This operator must be formally specifiable, not metaphorically gestured toward. It must actually generate new states through its operation, not merely describe generation. And it must recursively modify its own conditions of operation, not simply repeat a fixed procedure. Understands being as the stabilized residue of generative recursion, not as a pre-given substrate. What we call things or entities are temporary stabilizations in ongoing recursive processes. Being is what becoming produces when recursion achieves temporary coherence. Substance is slow process. Identity is persistent pattern. Satisfies the dual requirement of necessity and generativity. The constraints of reality must themselves be productive. True necessity doesn't merely limit, it generates through limitation. The boundary conditions are the engines, the constraints are the creators. Necessity and productivity are not combined but unified. Operates at the same order of recursion as the systems it seeks to understand, rather than merely describing them. Philosophy must match the recursive depth of reality itself. It cannot stand outside recursive systems and map them. It must operate recursively to engage with recursive reality. This definition is neither metaphorical nor approximate. It is not epistemic, concerning how we know. It is not process-based in the weak sense of emphasizing change. It is not physics reductive, though it learns from quantum mechanics. It is purely ontological, concerning the operational structure of being itself. Perpetualism satisfies all 6 requirements through the triune recursion, which begins from relation, the interpreter conceptualizable conceptualizability triad, operates generation through recursive modification, employs a formal operator that produces new states, treats stable entities as recursion residues, demonstrates necessary generation, and operates at reality's own recursive depth. This is why perpetualism represents the first fully realized post-quantum philosophy, not only because it was first chronologically, but also because it first satisfied all the structural requirements that define the category. Classical philosophy, even at its most sophisticated, fails at least one of these requirements, usually multiple. Post-quantum philosophy begins when all 6 are simultaneously fulfilled. The image accompanying this essay, the crystalline recursive triune, visualizes precisely this unified operation. The 3 interlocking flows are relation generating its nodes. The continuous movement is generation as primary operation. The recursive pathways are the formal operator in action. The momentary crystallizations are being as stabilized becoming. The structural constraint that creates flow is necessity as generation. The whole form operates rather than represents. This is what it means to cross the periphery, to achieve a philosophy that doesn't describe these 6 requirements but embodies them, that doesn't map recursive reality but operates recursively itself, that doesn't theorize generation but generates through its own application. The classical age could approach but not achieve this. The post-quantum age must require nothing less. For the minds that are ready,